Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Fearless Training Raw Knowledge podcast. I've got my San Pellegrino with me, the taste of Italy. And today we are talking all things nutrition, or within the realms of nutrition. And I'm joined by a phenomenal guest, Phil Smith. Phil, thanks for your time. I appreciate it. How are you?
Good, man. How are you?
I'm well. It's been a productive day here, and based on the beautiful conversation we've very well warmed up for, it's been quite a productive one for you as well, my friend.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a few client changes this morning, which is always good when clients start seeing positive results, which is always good to have to jump the gun and change a bit faster than we predicted. Keeping
you on your toes, my friend.
Yeah. I got to. They've changed the dates of the Queensland Weightlifting Association state championships by a month. So it's shortened that window by 4 weeks, which is a bit sort of shocking, but that's okay.
There you go. It's just being adaptable, on your feet with the skill sets, etc. It's always the same though. Murphy's Law. If something can change, it probably will.
Yeah, it probably will. Yeah, that's right.
Bill, let's start where we always do. Let's paint a bit of a picture for the audience, for the people listening, for the people watching. Who are you? What do you do? And more importantly, why do you do it?
Yeah, so Phil Smith, as Alex said, based in Townsville, Queensland, performance nutritionist by trade. So started my role, as most of us do, studying some type of science in JCU. So mine was applied science. Pretty much started my role just in the gym, getting asked, and I was studying science at the time, and kids would just come up to me and ask me about different things because I'm a larger build guy. So they would ask me questions about training and nutrition and what I do and what I take and all those things. And I couldn't believe these kids were doing what they were doing and had no concept about what they were doing. You know, they had no concept about the supplements they were taking, the products they were using, the training they were doing. So me knowing a little bit, but not a lot, I would go home and research what they had told me. And then I'd come back to the gym and sit them down and then literally like give them a personalized one-on-one lecture in the gym about whatever protocol or whatever sort of function they were doing and putting in their bodies. And that's sort of how it just steamrolled. And those questions started to evolve into more and more sort of specific and more technical based questions, either around nutrition or around training. And yeah, that sort of created a love for what I was doing. But that's a sort of a bit of a nutshell. The real truth is I was a very large kid. You know, I'm 138 kilos now, built, but at the time in my teenage years, I was 155 kilos in the wrong direction. You know, I was very large young guy. And the gist of it is I was in the hospital with my auntie. She was in a bad way. And my very, very overweight cousin looked at me and said, "Hey, Phil, this is you in a few years." And that shocked me like nobody's business. Within a week, I joined martial arts. Within 3 days, I was in the gym. And my life changed from there. And that's sort of where it all came from. And then I said, went to uni, applied sciences, was lucky enough to do a few courses after that, got my accreditation through my postgraduate in performance nutrition by IPN. And then just started down the role of performance nutrition, working with athletes and athletically minded people.
Fantastic, man. I appreciate you sharing that. I always like to understand where the protagonist was, or where the journey or the intersection was that led you to the path that you're on. And it's always funny because, you know, people meet you and they always assume this is the way you've always been sometimes, or this is the way you've always looked, even down to a haircut. And when you sort of ask the question and get to know people, sometimes it can be quite refreshing, but tell you a lot more about their story, which is good. And it's usually that it comes from a passion or even a health scare, if we can call it that, with yourself within that realms. For you, why now more performance-based nutrition versus perhaps maybe clinical or in that sort of remedial setting?
A lot of it is passion, to be honest. So athletic populations tend to be passionate about what they want to do with themselves, whether the level they want to take. And the reality is that I'll talk to anyone about anything as long as I can find passion in what they're talking about. I'll talk to a landscape gardener about hibiscus plants if I can find passion in their voice and passion in their tone. And that's what I find in athletic populations. And a lot of times, you know, Jenny from the suburbs or that sort of general population-based clientele will typically want to do something. We talk about the states of change, that they constantly live in that pre-contemplative state or that contemplative state. The action is generally intermittent, and that relapse phase is always returning. Whereas athletically minded individuals, and I use that phrase deliberately as we've discussed offline, it's the people who want to be better, but they may be an accountant, a lawyer, whatever the case, Monday to Friday, but when they train as if an athlete would. and they live as if an athlete would, but it's just not their profession. So athletically minded people and athletes in general are those who are passionate about what they do. And believe it or not, we've discussed in the past offline that my niche is strength sports, in particular CrossFit, but I actually fell into CrossFit through helping young guys get into special forces in the military. So we had these, obviously Townsville was a very large garrison base here, and we have a lot of the infantry's based here, and then those guys want to evolve into 2 Commando in Sydney or SAS in Perth, and they train very similar to a CrossFit style of training, multiple sessions a day, very heavy packs, very heavy loads, long extended endurance windows. So you've got this concurrent style of training happening all the time, and the military does not set themselves up for good education around nutrition. So that's where that steamroller started happening, that snowball effect happened. And then those guys would choose to do CrossFit outside of their military training, and it just evolved into that. So same again, it's that same conversation around passion. They were passionate about getting to Sydney or getting to Perth, and that's where I come in, and that's that love that I have for working with those sort of people.
Yeah, I think that's really an important element. Like you said, we've discussed off camera and off topic with terms of passion and connecting with people that are passionate about their sporting or their athletic endeavors, to probably put it more appropriately. And then also aligning that with what you're passionate about too. And therefore, you're going to want to work with those people and vice versa. Phil, could you give us a bit of an example of what your days look like now in terms of coaching clients online and with your one-on-one clients, and how that kind of looks? Because I know there's a lot of coaches that listen in to these podcasts, and even simple questions like this give people a bit of an insight to perhaps how they could run their days or their businesses, or where perhaps they could take them in the future.
Yeah, sure. So my day starts at 20 past 4. I get up at 20 past 4, or somewhere between 3:55 and 20 past 4 most mornings. I really do like that face-to-face element of the training world, or the fitness world, I should say. And that's something that I'll do my best never to have to give up. And I like to train. I've got a few young female clients who are actually competitive clients. They play semi-professional netball and a few other things as well, which I train face-to-face in the morning from about 5 a.m. till about sort of 8 or 9, depending on the day. And then from there, I'll come home and as I am now, I'll sit in my home office and I'll stare at a giant computer screen for the next 10 hours is pretty much what my day is, working with clients. And then a lot of video calls. So I try and touch base with my clients multiple times a week, whether it be in a Zoom call, in a text message, in an email, whatever the case may be. That's how I like to touch base. I've just had to shift because of the fact that my demand is so great now. And that's being honest, I have had to shift the way I operate SportPlus Performance, in the sense that I'm actually reducing my Zoom calls now in frequency, but then by regressing momentarily, I'll be able to progress the business with touch points with my clients even more so, because what you do face-to-face for an hour, you can probably achieve, hypothetically 20 text messages or 30 text messages to reach out to clients in that same amount of time. So as I said before, it's a temporary regression in order to progress. It's about structuring my business in a way that can progress and help as many people as I possibly can. And I'm not going to claim that. I've had I've discussed before, I've had a lot of help with from Reese and Kyle from Elite Vitality. Fantastic help, those guys. So that's the honest truth about how my day is structured. And then the afternoon, I really like to train about 4 p.m. And I've been very lucky enough to structure SportPlus that allows me to do that.
Yeah, no, 100%. That's definitely a productive and a demanding schedule, and perhaps a bit of an insight into a real world practitioner who's actually getting in there and doing the work. I think there's an ideology where a lot of people think, oh, you're just going to be sitting on a laptop and having a coffee or out on a beach or taking some pictures, where I think a lot of what I like to call the real deal people who are actually providing a difference are very much on the tools and very much putting in the hours, especially in the early days. But I guess to flip the coin as well, like you said, with the guys at Elite Vitality, they are great. I've now spoke to a few practitioners about how they've helped them scale their business by, as you said, taking a bit of a backward step, being able to create systems and processes, not just because it's more efficient and effective, but ultimately you can achieve your goal of enjoying your workflow more and helping more people, which I think is critical for longevity over time. Before we get into some more specific questions around nutrition, could you perhaps set a definition for those listening in terms of what are the main differentials between, performance nutrition coaching versus say your general population, I don't really like that word, general population, I'll be honest with you, but say someone who is, I guess, just coaching people in a generalized term of nutrition, whether it is general population or even in like a clinical setting. So people who obviously have ailments and they're trying to get them up. Like, what are some of the main broad strokes or the differences between that?
I would say nutrition timing is probably the biggest one. So in a performance setting, application of, for example, carbohydrates, protein for recovery, things like that become much more specific to the individual and also to the task at hand. Whereas, you know, I'm sure we all follow enough, you know, Instagram accounts now to say that total calorie intake is relevant to whatever surplus or deficit the individual's in, and that's how the person's going to get results, be it weight loss or muscle mass. But in a performance realm, working with elite and sub-elite individuals, that timing really does come into play. What carbohydrates you're using, how you're applying them. Are you doing it too much or too close to the actual given activity? Are you doing it too much through that given activity? So that's the big one, is application of a timing structure of nutrition. Are they having too much fiber prior to an event? Is that going to affect their gastric motility? Is that going to affect their sickness, their humoral immunity? All of these things are going to come into play. So that's probably the nutshell answer is timing.
Oh, perfect. I love this because I'm going to start asking some more pointy questions now because we're going to get a bit selfish with these questions. Now, I'm not going to label you with a food type because I know you get this question a lot and then people hang on to certain foods and think they're magic. So before we get into specifics, because you know where this is going.
I do.
I think it's best to cover what are the most common misconceptions that you have to help clients and students with when it comes to nutrition. And I think that might be good just to set a bit of a background. I'm sure some coaches will already know this, but there's a lot of people who won't. Whether that's meal timing, which you've just talked about, whether that's energy balance, whether that's, you know, and I'm going to use quotations for people who are listening, clean versus dirty, you know, whole foods versus processed. And I've got some really interesting questions on that later on. And then anything above, you know, fasted cardios, things like that, keto diets, different types of dietary fads or even sort of categories. And I'm just throwing things out there. So take your time with these, but I guess some main points to kind of just set the scene, because I'm sure there'll be some big, I guess, elephants in the room, which we could just slay really quickly. So people can go, okay, we're on the same page.
Yeah, so there's actually quite a few, and the three that come to mind straight away is choice of carbohydrate to you know, quote unquote fuel a workout. So you'll see a lot of the times that, and this is I use this analogy a lot, but a lot of them they'll walk in, they'll sit in front of you, and they'll have their mince and their sweet potato and they're going, oh, pre-workout carbs. Then you have to sort of point out, well, hang on a minute, that sweet potato is not fueling today's workout. It's fueling tomorrow's workout, if anything at all. You know, it's such a slow digesting carbohydrate. I believe it's about sort of 7 to 9 hours in most cases before that carbohydrate even touches the bloodstream. So unless you're going to train this evening, it's not doing sweet FA for your workout. That's probably the first one is choice of carbohydrate coming into a session of higher intensity. Now, it's really important we touch on that because obviously intensity drives what fuel is utilized. Well, predominantly utilized, I should say. The second is, even in elite level sports, is carbohydrates are okay. Now, that sounds ridiculous that is sort of like that, but you have to understand that a lot of with the passion comes the ability of a person to just do what they're told when they're told to do it. And a lot of the times these athletes come to people like me because they don't have an idea about what they need to, how they need to apply nutrition. So they might be consuming the right amount of calories as a whole, so energy intake could be adequate. But, and this happens a lot, in the CrossFit arena, and that is to do with the keto diet, the paleo diet, things like that, where they, once again, haven't got quite the right source of carbohydrates or the right source of nutrients coming into their system, but the inability for them to comprehend that fats will not get you past that threshold. They will not let you, structure yourself so your output can be above 85%. That's one of the biggest ones. And then also understanding that recovery aspect, and I'm gonna utilize CrossFit because it's one of the ones that I wanted to. I do specialize in it, but also it's a really good, easy application of these conversations as well. And I suppose we'll use just general fitness as well. A lot of people do cardio in the morning and they might do weights in the afternoon. So we'll talk about multiple sessions a day, right? with cardio training, especially at higher intensity, so you could be doing HIIT training in the morning, for example, in a physique environment. Your coach might, or yourself might be out there with your clients doing HIIT style training in the morning, which is quite heavily glycogen depleting. Whereas weight sessions aren't necessarily heavily glycogen depleting, to be honest with you. They're about 30% glycogen depletion at most. What's going to happen is they're going to take in their carbohydrates after they do the HIIT session, or in a CrossFit environment before their first session in the morning. Later in the day, to be any good at CrossFit, you only do 2 sessions a day in most cases, or in case of physique competition, you might do a sort of HIIT and then also weights in the afternoon. You've then got to realize that your choice of carbohydrate post-workout is going to affect how much glycogen you synthesize for the afternoon session. So if you're training your ass off in the morning and then going home and having oats with high fat and all of these things, you may still feel lackluster in the afternoon for the afternoon session because of the way that the choice of food you've consumed, it digests and passes through the lumen. It passes from the gut into the bloodstream. If you've got any sort of roadblock there, whether it be via the way of a high fat content in your diet, in your breakfast choice, whether it be a high fiber content in your breakfast choice, all of these things slow down motility. They slow down the passage of the carbohydrate into the bloodstream, and that's going to slow down the resynthesis of glycogen. So those 3 things will always affect, or always going to be hiccups and roadblocks when I approach a client, or when a client approaches me, I should say.
That last one really fascinates me. And I think this is, I guess, we talked about this off camera, furthering education, and we'll talk a little bit about that in your role with Sports Nutrition Australia, I'm sure, as we go. Within those, and again, for most people, I'm sure it's not always going to be that specific. They don't need to know, but from the, I guess, performance side of things, it's definitely imperative understanding those sort of, I guess, biases or concepts, if you will, in relation to carbohydrate fueling versus like more of a fat-based approach. Now, we've got athletes out there who compete with a keto approach. We have some of them which we would call maybe even a hybrid, where they're like, hey, I'm keto, but before my event, I'm going to load on carbohydrate, etc. And obviously we get the more conventional, if you like, athletes who will stay with the carbohydrate loading. With those sort of 3 elements, what are some of the, based on your knowledge and the current literature, for the best or the most advantageous approaches for performance-based athletes? And again, you might need to separate depending whether they're CrossFit, whether it's an athlete on a rugby pitch or an endurance athlete, the best modalities to fuel performance. Like, for example, could you give us some specific examples of what that looks like? Are you increasing dosage of carbohydrate before the event? If so, what type of carbohydrate is there? I might even throw in, I'm getting excited here, Ross Edgley, because obviously swam around Great Britain. This is a really extreme example, but I'm really interested in things like that because I think that they really extrapolate and highlight certain concepts of what we're capable of, or certain energy systems and how things work in the body, because it's like, wow, this is very extreme. Or even like Tour de France athletes, besides perhaps other things as well that are being taken and going on. So I guess if you could explain some sort of, if there is any merit to using fat as a primary energy source, or if it is conclusive that carbohydrate definitely is the primary fuel source, and if what are some of the specifics, because I might be very much oversimplifying that with my lack of education in this area.
So that is a very complex question, to be honest, and the short reason is why is the more, man, I'll use a marathon runner as an example, if that's okay. The marathon runner, and I mean a seasoned marathon runner, not a person who's giving a marathon a red hot go, okay? As you become more adapted to the style of output you choose, so in this case, a consistent run, this is very clear, this doesn't include the sprint portions of the marathon. This is just purely a constant pace. Your body's ability to utilize fat as fuel actually increases. So believe it or not, a leaner person who is aerobically adapted to their output will actually have a better utilization of fat than an obese person, because an obese person generally has a poor ability to actually process and utilize fats. And that's because of a thing called lipotoxemia. So they release too many fats, they release too many inflammatory responses in the body, and you actually end up with toxic levels in the blood. So whilst the whole entire release of fats as a whole is about the same, they can't release as much per unit of fat as they could in a lean person. Does that make sense? Because there's so much fat in an obese person.
And actually,
yeah. So a leaner person will have a better response of fat than an obese person. But you have to also take into account that a marathon isn't a consistent pace. Generally it's outdoors, it's undulating, the ground goes up, the ground goes down, you have to overtake people, you have to sort of hang back, you have to draft on people, things like that. So having an ability to access carbohydrates allows you to go past that 85th percentile of output. So fats will only generally work up until about 75 to 80%. Now there's a discrepancy there, but generally it's about 75%. I like to say 70 because you want to have that window of change, right? So the more metabolically efficient an individual is, the better their change is going to be from one fuel source to the other. But it does change per person. So it's important we have that bit of a buffer there as well. The reason why that's the case is the long story short of this is your body cannot utilize fuel fast enough. It cannot convert fat into energy by the way of pyruvate by the way of acetyl-CoA fast enough that it can utilize fats in those high intensity windows. It must be done by the way carbohydrates. So you need to have a good metabolic efficiency. Now, the example you used about people who tend to live on fats in their training and then will carb load, the best example of that would be Zach Bitter. Zach Bitter he's a poster child for keto. He tends to train in a ketogenic state or a fat dependent state, and then about 3 or 4 weeks out from his event he'll start to carbo load and start to load up high on carbohydrates, and that allows an enzyme called PDH or pyruvate dehydrogenase to turn the carb function back on, and then that allows his body to access carbohydrates in a very, very efficient format during the race. Okay, training in a low state, it increases a thing called mitochondrial biogenesis, which is basically the creation of new mitochondria, which I'm sure you know is the engine of the cell. The more engines we have, once we turn that carbohydrate access back on, we can then utilize more fuel more efficiently. And then also the more engines we have, we can break down that fat at a slightly higher rate. So we've got that efficiency to swap between carbohydrates and fat at this, very, very easily. And that's that metabolic efficiency, if that makes sense. That's a huge answer for a very specific question. Now, going on to something like a high intensity based sport, not necessarily CrossFit, but just high intensity in general, could be a HIIT session. That would be dependent on the time frame in which the duration is. So sub 60 minutes, sub 45 minutes. I generally wouldn't dose that much unless it was a carnival based event. So for example, CrossFit weekends, all stars, things like that. They'll have multiple tournaments. CrossFit tournament, have multiple events across each day. The whole thing goes for 2 days. Now we have to synthesize glycogen very, very quickly back into the system. So you're not really going to get much synthesis prior to 8 hours. So you might have to do a little bit of a carbo spike in the morning. They might do the first event, immediate glucose response afterwards, so glucose feeding, and then do that progressively through the day. Now, that's where you have to really, really structure low fiber, low fat intake so the person doesn't have any roadblocks in their digestive system. It's going to be all quick succession. Even when it comes to protein, you choose things like mince. You choose things like really, really easy digestible proteins, like, for example, it could be a liquid protein, for example, because you want to minimize any roadblock in digestion.
That makes sense.
The Ross Edgley one is a really interesting one because that's going to be sustained mixture of fuel. He's going to utilize both, it could be a fat bar, for example. They make these peanut butter bars now because his energy is, it's going to be delayed, but also need to spike. So it's very similar to that Zach Bitter conversation where he runs these ultra marathons, trains on fat, accesses the event on carbohydrates. Because once again, he's swimming around the UK, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the UK water isn't a constant drag. He's going to have tail waves. He's going to have head waves. He's going to have some drift. He's going to have some rips. He's going to have to fight against those. And that would be equivalent to an undulation in a marathon run.
That makes sense.
That was a lot of information. Does that make sense?
That was good. No, that was good.
Yeah.
And it was, because it was a complex question that probably needed a complex answer. And that's probably me being a bit more selfish there. People will be listening like, what's he fucking on about? Don't worry, guys. I'll bring it back on track. But no, I think because there's always crossovers and things that you can learn and take from the extremes and then go, okay, well, if that's actually how it works at that end, perhaps maybe we're overthinking it at the simple end. So I think to kind of give a bit of an opposite or flip the coin on that question for a lot of listeners that will be tuning into this podcast, what are some recommendations and considerations around pre and post workout nutrition for the bodybuilder, for the physique athlete, for the general gym goer or recomposition sort of goal, in terms of nutritional timing, and even then looking at dosages and types of carbohydrates, and maybe giving a few, again, real life examples to kind of give an opposite and perhaps more applicable, because, well, there is a few athletes that tune in, but most people are not going to be doing that extreme sort of, I guess, performance output.
Sure. So with a recomp client, and I'll simply target the recomp clients because generally they're going to be either at maintenance or maybe in a slight deficit in some cases, or if they're sort of more seasoned people looking for a recomp, maybe they've gone wayward from their training for a window of time, they might be in a slight surplus. Whatever the case may be, you would bring the idea behind a recomp is to basically, increase lean muscle tissue and then decrease body fat or subcutaneous body fat, which you can visually see. You definitely want to look at bringing those carbohydrates in and around a workout. Now that sounds very, very mainstream, very Instagram based, but that's the reality. We want to have the fuel available to us when we need it, and not so much when we don't need it. So it depends on when the individual trains, but definitely I would look at sort of 30 to 50% of their carbohydrates pre-workout, probably a little bit closer to that 30%, maybe 40%, and then definitely that resynthesis in the aftermath. So definitely the sort of that 50%, and then the rest would come from maybe, for example, like cruciferous vegetables, things like that. Now, in that case, you'd have to talk about the individuality of when's the person training. If they're recomping, they could be upping their cardio, for example. If they're more of a, F cardio type person, they might just be training once. If that's the case, you've got after they train, right until the next time in which they train to resynthesize glycogen. So there's no real need to rush it. So it could be, for example, a slow, just general food intake, which can resynthesize that glycogen. If they're a person who might train Monday nights and then Tuesday morning, a little bit more of a rush involved. So you might choose, like a white bread or a white rice with a semi pre-digested sort of state mince, for example. Like, once again, mince is very easy because it's easy digested, high surface area, high contact point of stomach acids and things like that. So it's going to be easily passed through the gut with minimal sort of mastication needed by the client. Okay. Pre-workout, once again, anything that's high glycemic index. I've got clients who use Milo cereal. If you're aware what Milo cereal is, I've got a client in New Zealand who uses Nutrigrain, things like that. He loves cereal. Okay. But it could be things like, it could be, salted pretzels. It could be bagels, it could be white bread. It could be a liquid carbohydrate if you're a person who struggles with food volume. Maybe the case, maybe this person's been in low EA for a period of time and you get back to the adequate EA or energy availability that's known as. That means that they're going to have adequate nutrients left over after exercise in order to look after their bodily functions. That's what energy availability translates as. So it's important that we do try and keep that client in an adequate amount of energy availability in order to fuel not only their workouts, but also their bodily functions. Because the health is key, right? You can, at the upper echelons, performance and health don't necessarily line up, but you can't have performance unless you have health.
100%. That's a really good summarizing point, I think, to end on that one there. With regards to, because when we talk about nutritional timing as well, we look at it in relation to a bigger picture. So based on the knowledge I've learned, we look at behavior and lifestyle, energy balance, macronutrients, micronutrients, food selection within that, then nutrient timing and supplementation. And I don't know if that rings true with the order of hierarchy you would go with.
That's the Eric Helms hierarchy.
Correct. Is the muscle pyramids, etc.
Yeah.
So when we've got all those covered, because a lot of people come in and they say, "Hey, look, Alex, they're smashing shakes after they work out. They're trying to get that." And I'm like, "Oh, hang on a minute. I'm like, this is good." But I'm like, let's look at like maybe the bigger concepts. Like, do you even know any kind of calories you're eating first? Like, there's these sort of. So, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it is almost more important to get the bulk of the energy balance and even the macronutrients and the micronutrients correct first with, say, more of a newer or a beginner client before, even though we look at pre and post workout considerations? Or is it something that you would very quickly go, hey, even though, yes, we want some basic guidelines about making sure there is some nutrients available pre and post workout, is that something that you're going to go through generally with your clients first in relation to getting those basics, and then as they become more advanced, then focusing in on, hey, like nutrient timing, this is now going to be more important because now this is another box that needs to be checked to contribute to performance and recomp or whatever the goal might be?
No, you're absolutely bang on. So total intake, so total energy intake always comes first in every opportunity. What you might do is you might encourage them to split it up. So if they're a person who tends to skip breakfast, have a massive lunch and massive dinner, you might say, listen, hey, not only do we need to improve your total energy intake, but I recommend that you do it this way, and that's going to enhance your results down the track, for example, because we know that, sort of multiple protein feedings across a day will always render better response than, say, 2 massive bolus doses. 2 massive bolus doses is better than none at all, but it's still not optimal versus, say, multiple feedings across the day. Sort of 3 to 4 feedings is where you want to start. Now, in saying that, though, it goes back to the concept about athletes having really, all the gear and no idea when it comes to their nutrition, in the sense that you have to sort of do this conversation a lot with athletes as well. It's not always going to be these people walk in with just golden child type behavior. It's not the case at all. A lot of these people have to be taught on how to structure it. So the first premise, which was going to be to get their energy availability up to scratch, and then focus on just total energy intake. In fact, that's one of the notations I make in people who have inadequate energy availability. I'll say to them, first up, phase 1 will be just getting you to consume enough nutrients to fuel your output. And then after we create those good habits, and it's all about behaviors and habits, because that's how you continue on, that's how you create continuity in your training and your performances, and allow that person to, to lack of a better word, to feel the benefits of good nutrition, feel the benefits of adequate energy availability. Then we start to go, all right, now let's look at this, and that could be timing, training windows, all of those things. But definitely total energy intake is absolutely primary.
For sure. No, good to sort of go over those points and I guess emphasize and double check them while we're here. And I really want to, as you're passionate about, like myself, the application, the behavior and the habits. But before we, get into that, what I'd like to define as well is the differences between complex and simple carbohydrates. And I guess in or in a simplistic way, or how maybe you teach your clients, how would you describe that? How could we define that for the people listening, and how they affect and are metabolized in the body? And I think to kind of tie into that, you probably get this statement. Alex, Phil, is it bad that I'm consuming this much sugar a day? Well, okay, well, let's have a look. Where's this coming from? Or I'm cutting sugar out of my diet completely. Are you know? So that's where I'm going with that question. You already know, but I think it's really good to educate people on, okay, well, where does sugar come from? How's it broken down in the body? Is it fructose, glucose, galactose, all this carry on? And then what is the partitioning of that? So perhaps if you want to wrap that up, perhaps in the way you teach it, to say, hey, look, this is what you need to be concerned about. This is what you don't, and this is why. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So no, it does, absolutely. And one of the things that I'll differentiate, something you started with, was complex versus simple carbohydrates. Now, I tend not to use those terms. Mm-hmm. The reason why, and I'll explain in a second, but I use the term low fiber and fiber rich foods. Okay. And the reason why I use those terms is because if we talk about simple and complex carbohydrates, immediately we eliminate fruit. So, anyone who tells you that fruit makes you fat is an idiot, needs to hand back their man card and move on with life. So, if we talk about simple carbohydrates being bad, or quote unquote bad, we're talking about fruit. So we need to sort of eliminate those terminologies, low fiber or fiber rich foods.
Okay.
I know you said it tongue in cheek, but hey, I've eliminated sugar from my diet. I'm only eating potato and rice. Okay, right. You're still eating glucose, aren't you? The body breaks down, whether it be polysaccharides, monosaccharides, whatever the case may be. In most cases, with the elimination of say like galactose or fructose, which is the other monosaccharides, the body's going to break down carbohydrates into glucose, which is going to pass, straight into the bloodstream, straight up to the liver, and get processed where they need to get processed from, right? It doesn't matter where it comes from, and what's going to slow that down is the fiber content, what you have it with. When was the last time you, Alex, sat down and had a bowl of rice as it is after an 8-hour fast? So you woke up from the night's sleep and you just had 75 grams of rice and that was it, called it a day. That's not a meal, right? It might be in China, but it's not here in Australia.
Yeah, no, and so even add some sauce to that as well, because you got to get it sliced.
Even add some sauce to it. So the conversation around like glycemic index and stuff like that is a little bit skewed in most cases, because that's done 75 grams of a cooked weight of a product after an 8-hour fast. by itself in isolation. No, that's not applicable to the everyday world.
Mm.
In saying that though, what you add it to will slow that down. If you have, for example, steak and potato, whatever potato's GI might be, so glycemic index might be, immediately the protein will slow that down. Immediately the fat content from the steak will slow that down. The sauces, as you mentioned, will slow that down. So it's really important we do understand that as well. This goes back to the conversation around sweet potato before a workout, right? Not only is that a high fiber-based food, it's also going to be eaten in conjunction with another macronutrient, which is going to slow it down even further. So there's some things to think about. How I explain it to clients is pretty much like that. You need to know what foods are applicable at what time, but also how to appropriate those things. And I don't get too much into the, how foods are processed in the body. I might talk about, for example, carbohydrates go through the gut wall, which is called the lumen, and then they go into the hepatic portal vein up to the liver, and the liver sort of filters out what it needs and utilizes what it needs, and it goes to where it needs to go into the bloodstream. Fats, on the other hand, don't do that. Fats go through the lymphatic system, so it's a little bit different. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. No, and it's good as well. And I mean, I'm learning as well as I go here, which is good. So I'm always trying to, extend my knowledge and I guess terminology as well with ideologies and terminologies, because a lot of people, it's, oh, this is bad, this is good, this is this binary mindset that we try and get rid of and understand. Well, if we understand it where we can simplistically at a mechanistic level, we can perhaps go, oh, that's not true, because I think that sort of can create negative relationships with food, because people go, I can't, it's not on the table, I can't eat that.
Yeah.
If I eat that, like you said, it'll turn to this. It's like, well, it doesn't actually do that. The body doesn't go, right, I've eaten this nutrient, store it as fat. Like it just, that's not, just because it's a chocolate bar or whatever it might be, or this clean and dirty.
So that's sorry. I just remembered something else you asked as well, and sorry to interrupt, but another good sort of consideration is exactly what you just said, the chocolate bar. You mentioned sugar before, and we joked about eliminating sugar will have you actually really, isocalorically, it's important to understand that if the individual has control, it doesn't matter where the carbohydrate comes from, whether it be a jube or a jelly bean or sweet potato. If it's isocaloric, meaning equal in calories or equal in energy intake, there is no additional fat gained or lost. Okay, that's really, really important we understand that. What actually happens is it's the source food. So in this conversation, we're talking about sweet potato or a jelly bean. Obviously, the satiety levels are going to decrease with sweet potato because you've got the fiber, you've got higher food volume. As Mac Baker says, it lower cost per bite is his phrase that he uses. So you've got a lower calorie consumption per bite of a certain given food, in this case sweet potato, versus that of a jelly bean. Okay, the higher sugar content also creates a higher palatability as well, which means it's harder for that person to stop. So we have to have a whole bunch of cognitive sort of abilities to actually stop ourselves from eating those jelly beans as well. But you're not going to gain more or less weight choosing a certain food if given the control parameters are set in place. Mm-hmm. Okay, your body doesn't go, oh my god, this sugar's from a jelly bean, that's it, I'm going to put it into fat. The process of turning carbohydrates into fat is called de novo lipogenesis. It's a really, really, really thirsty process. The body doesn't like to do it. And in most cases, if you have what's called a mixed meal, so a meal that contains protein, fats, and carbs, your body will generally utilize the carbohydrates first. And if it's in surplus, where your total energy expenditure, so total energy intake is a surplus, it's the fat that will get stored, not the carbohydrate. Your carbohydrate will be stored as glycogen and or utilized for energy. Okay. What actually happens is what gets stored is the fat component of those meals, not the carbs.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So on the back of that question then, and this is a bit more of a specific one that I'm interested in, and understanding the discrepancies here, and perhaps there is going to be some individuality which comes in, which is, for example, if we look at, say I require, let's just make it easy, 3,000 calories, right? I have, say, 180 to 200 grams of protein. That's my staple. I'm always kind of getting within the ballpark. And say I have a variance in fat and carbohydrates. So I might say, cool, I'm going to sit between like minimum 60 grams of fat, could go all the way up to 100. And then with my carbohydrates, it could be 300 up to 500 or whatever it is. If I I'm looking at body recomposition and looking at from an aesthetic standpoint, and I say go from having, say, 75 grams of fat to 420 grams of carbs, whatever it works out as. And then I slowly switch that over time and actually increase my fats to, say, 100 and drop my carbs. Will that affect body composition over time? Or even if I even more extremely switch the fat from the carbs, but still reach the same caloric threshold, based on your experience, will that change body composition? I mean, it will definitely, I imagine, affect performance especially if you get to a really low carbohydrate intake. But I have found personally, for me, when my fats just reach a certain threshold, just don't have the same kind of look. But I've also realized it could be the carbohydrate dosage is down, so therefore I don't look as full because I don't have as much glycogen saturation, which could actually create illusion that I'm fuller and bigger than I am, where with fats I'm a little bit flatter, but I've still equaled the same caloric threshold. Does that make sense, or right?
Yeah, it does. The short answer is if the total intake is equated, the short answer is no. You won't gain or lose any total weight. You know, if your protein's matched, obviously you're going to maintain lean muscle mass. Carbs aren't protein sparing. Sorry, apologies. Fat isn't protein sparing, whereas carbohydrates are. To go on your personal experience, you've nailed it on the head, right? So what's going to happen is you're going to have a lower saturation of glycogen, but also on top of that as well, your rate of perceived exertion on a high fat diet is going to be higher, which means you may find it harder to achieve a higher output, which means you may have a lower burn rate, energy expenditure, I should say, rather than commonly I call it burn rate, but yeah, the fancy way of saying is energy expenditure. So your perceived output will also be higher, which means your chances of actually training as hard will be lower. And that could account for things like water hold, sodium hold, for example, because a lot of those highly palatable foods that come along with fats are going to be high sodium, things like that. So there'll always be some flux there as well, but actual, composition, it probably won't change.
Yeah. No, that's good to cover. Interesting stuff, because I'm fascinated with those little, I guess, specifics of how you can manipulate and change. And it's like, okay, well, this is the law of thermodynamics, but is there any other sort of nuances within that and individuality between changing those ratios? Because obviously when we talk with clients, we go, hey, look, we live in the real world. You don't have to nail this. Let's go for the calorie threshold. Let's try and keep protein consistent being, a more important role in the body, lots of other bodily functions, and especially if we are interested in lean tissue and general health. But then fats and carbs, as long as we've got some minimums, like, let's be a little bit flexible. Like, oh, you consumed a meal which was higher in fat. Oh, like, what are you going to do? Like, you just stop there? It's like, no, okay, maybe you drop your carbohydrates to still hit the calorie target. And I guess we'll talk about some applications and more of the coaching questions in a minute. Before we do, I'd love to talk about special populations to a degree, or even sort of more diets. I'd love to mention and talk about plant-based nutrition and also vegan, purely based on the fact that I know there's a lot of myths and misconceptions, but also there's a lot of people who adopt these diets, which, there's nothing wrong with if you're doing it for the right reasons, in my opinion. But I'd love to perhaps get some takeaways for people who have adopted that style of eating, perhaps giving them some facts if they want to continue that way, or it might even be having some understandings of going, you know what, perhaps I'm doing this for the wrong reason, therefore I'll start incorporating different foods. And I guess to caveat that, based on where I'm at, from what I've learned, from what I've listened, I'm of the mindset that if you can eat anything and everything in terms of food variety, it would be more advantageous, because you would be less micronutrient and nutrient deficient in general. Because surely if you are someone who is consuming, and it's not, again, a quantity, like eat everything, it's okay, you're getting some blueberries, you're getting this type of fruit, you're getting this type of meat, this type of fish, this type of protein, this type of carb, it would be ideal. But obviously there's cultural and behavioral issues and facts that we could talk about. But I guess for people who now have adopted it, we might, game changers, let's not maybe go down that rabbit hole. There's a lot of facades there which have been sort of slayed, but maybe talking through some of your experiences coaching plant-based athletes and persons, and even, again, some takeaways for people listening that they could better implement a plant-based approach.
Yeah, so with plant-based individuals, and I do like the fact you've used that phrase, plant-based individuals, and not necessarily vegan or vegetarian for that matter, because it's important to decipher. You can be plant-based and still consume animal products. So you can still a plant-based individual to me does not necessarily mean someone who eliminates all animal products out of their life. They can just be majority of their intake could be plant-based, for example. I think it's important to point out, as you just touched on, and one of the ones that really grinds my gears is the hate on dairy. There was a really good meta-analysis that came out 2000. I want to say 2019. It came out, but I could be 18. It was 83 studies in the hundreds of thousands of participants in across all 83 studies that basically concluded that not only is dairy not pro-inflammatory, it's actually anti-inflammatory. It actually prevents and minimizes risk of things like bowel cancer, colon cancer, all of these things, which is completely against what all the zealots and all the online gurus will tell you. But when we look at milk and milk protein, in more specifically, we're talking about one of the highest utilizations of leucine, in the human diet. It's when it comes to lean body mass, so lean body tissue and accretion of that, it's going to be the highest output we can get because just the leucine is so much higher. Leucine, and obviously the best thing to do when versing it, we use the common one is obviously whey protein, which is a component of dairy for those who aren't too sure about that. So obviously in milk, we talk about the two milk proteins, one being casein, one being whey. Casein's 80% of milk, if you didn't know that, and whey is 20%. When we verse those two versus, say, for example, soy, whey will always beat soy. Soy will generally beat casein in the leucine content. And leucine's the only amino acid instigator of muscle protein synthesis when it comes to the nutrition realm. Obviously, resistance training is going to do it as well, but when it comes to nutrition, leucine's the king when it comes to that. Soy is a little bit lackluster in its content of leucine unless you get a fortified product. So fortified means they've literally just added the standalone amino acid to the soy product. It's pretty good in everything else, but you do need to get a fortified soy or a fortified version of a plant-based protein powder if you want to go down that route as well. One of the ones that I like, to be honest, is when they blend pea protein and brown rice protein together. The reason why is that's called a complementary protein, and individually there's going to be missing amino acids or the right amounts of amino acids missing from each one. And then when you put them together synergistically, they actually bring that up to scratch to make it a complete protein and make the adequate ratios to be correct. I've forgotten which one it is, but one's missing methionine and one's surplus methionine. One's missing lysine, the other one's surplus lysine. So put them together, they end up as a complementary protein. But the reality, going back onto someone who wants to live a plant-based lifestyle in a whole food situation, it's not really whole food, but TVP, if you're unfamiliar with that, it's called textured vegetable protein, is one of the best, plant-based protein source you get. It comes in a dried format. You put it in water, you add it to water, and it sort of hydrates, and it has a very sort of like mince texture, I suppose you would say. And you make chili con carne out of it, you make tacos out of it, things like that. But I have a client who lives in Canada who puts it on yogurt in the morning to just boost her protein. Once again, not a vegan individual, just happens to like a lot of plants in her diet. But most of the considerations around plant-based individuals who want to consume protein via the way of a non-biological source is the components that those proteins come with. So not only are they generally incomplete sources, so you've got to combine food choices together, beans and brown rice, carrots and brown rice, things like that. But you also consider that a lot of them are attached to carbohydrates. So not only can you consider the protein content, but you have to consider everything else as well. So also protein quality is a big one as well. So, you mentioned Game Changers. They chose to use white bread and peanut butter, I think it was. I turned the show off. I couldn't watch the whole thing. But they're talking about how it's equal to a whey shake. And it's just not. The quality of protein is just not there. The bioavailability of the protein is just not there. So having an array of complementary protein or complementary amino acids coming from various food sources is very, very important in the vegan world. So, that in mind, I generally like people to stick to soy-based products where they can. There's no hormonal implications of soy. That's a really important thing to point out, unless you're eating kilos of the stuff a day, which if you've got enough beans and legumes and things like that in your diet, you don't have to worry about. But yeah, definitely to go on your point, if you have no ethical complications with what you eat, a balanced diet of a range of foods is always going to be the best option.
For sure. No, I appreciate you you've answered a lot of the other questions I was good, because I know there was going to be a couple of other things. Oh, what about this? What about soy? So
Yeah.
thank you for that answer, Phil. That was really good.
Oh, and just one
well-rounded.
more thing to add. Sorry, Alex, just touch on that one other thing as well. When it comes to deficiencies in plant-based individuals, it's important we point out that, and I'll use iron as an example. In biological sources, we have what's called heme iron. Now, iron is not really well absorbed anyway. It's about sort of 8 to 9% in heme iron. So from biological sources, non-heme iron is about 2 to 3% absorbed, which is very low. So if they are going to choose things like spinach, for example, they want to do it with vitamin C. Vitamin C will always increase the absorption of a non-heme iron position. So it could be, like a big wilted vegetable breakfast meal of some sort, and then a glass of orange juice or a glass of pomegranate juice or cranberry juice or something along those lines will be a good source. But definitely make sure you got a vitamin C source along with that iron to ensure it. And obviously, and I also believe in supplementing with calcium, and then also with vitamin B12 as well.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's good, because I think iron's a really big, like a lot of the time with obviously plant-based nutrition, it's not thought of, or for the general sort of, I guess, gym goer, they don't really understand it and how it affects performance and even just health in general. Sometimes you can see it in performance athletes with like amenorrhea and things like that, and deficiencies obviously more in females in that population. Also as well, I guess, to tack on fiber considerations, because obviously if someone is going to be mostly plant centric with their approach, the fiber can get quite high. Wind,
right, yeah.
Gastric distress. Have you got any, I guess, strategies or any recommendations to kind of keep fiber somewhat relative with obviously the increase of obviously whole foods?
Yeah, it's exactly to go against exactly what you just said. So if you have a person, and let's face it, like we said before, about a lot of the plant-based proteins are going to be attached to a carbohydrate, and generally in most cases that carbohydrate is going to be high fiber, like you said. Any additional carbohydrate you would opt for would generally be a low fiber, or what's called a low residue based carbohydrate. So a carbohydrate that has little to no fiber in it. So it could be, for example, white bread, it could be white rice, it could be something like that, but something's going to have a low residue count or a low fiber content, because you're already getting enough of it from typically your protein sources or from your vegetable sources. So you have to be very aware of those numbers. Especially if the individual is like an endurance athlete, where fiber can cause real gastric distress, both short and long term as well. And obviously hydration is a big factor there as well. Make sure the person is adequately hydrated in order to, moisten the fiber in the gut and allow that passage to actually occur.
For sure. No, 100%. I'll deviate back to, I think as well, in essence of time, because I want to cover this before we finish, which is more the application, which arguably is probably more important than all of this, where when we talk about like behavior and lifestyle and actually communicating this to clients and maybe giving some real life examples. I'd love to bookmark two things, working with diabetic clients and also processed foods versus whole foods. And I'll specify that later if we get to it in terms of ratios and discrepancies. I guess to use a generalization, it's like, hey, look, depending on the totality of your caloric intake, let's go with 80% for the most part whole food, 20% processed, and perhaps some diminishing returns. I was having a conversation with a nutrition client this morning who's actually a really good clinician about this. And I was like, I'm going to chat to Phil tonight and pose this question to him. So we're interested to get your take on it. But I guess for in essence of the listeners and coaches, let's talk more about application of knowledge now and how you effectively communicate this to your clients. And I guess to be a bit more specific, for example, what sort of visual cues and aids do you use? Obviously Zoom, I imagine, text messages, it might be,
Yep.
I don't know if you have your own Google Sheets and documents, but I guess what are some of the methodologies you use to help communicate these concepts to people in a way that they can actually apply it and then obviously sustain the results over time?
Yeah, so I'm actually, to be honest with you, man, I'm only new to Google Sheets because I said up until the change in my direction of SportPlus Performance, I've actually done all my check-ins via video, via Zoom link, or if they're local here in Townsville, in person. So I take notes when the person's with me or when the person's talking to me via video chat. So Google Sheets is something I've just recently brought in as well. But I use there's an online program, or it's an app for you. If you remember back in the day, the chat rooms online, there's a thing called Slack. So Slack is basically the chat room for 2021. The reason why I've opted for Slack as opposed to say like a Facebook group or something like that is because you get lost in notifications. I mean, I wake up to 30 notifications in a day, every time I wake up in the morning. So I don't want to lose stuff. And I'm horrible on messaging on social media, where Slack is a bit like an additional messenger, I suppose you would say. It comes up and it just tells me there's a message there. But it also has a databaseable area to it. So you can actually, for example, say, you might ask me a question. You're a client of mine. You ask me a question on vitamin D, hypothetically. Hey, Phil, what's the inactive version of vitamin D? Okay, 25 OHD, da-da-da-da-da. In 6 months' time, Jenny could be going, oh, shit, Phil posted that thing about vitamin D a while back. Search vitamin D, and then all of the posts about vitamin D will come up in Slack for her to choose from. So that's why I use Slack. I can do private messaging as well. I can centralize all of my information. So if a person does have any questions, it can all be done via Slack, and it's not multiple touch points. I used to use Instagram video chat, Facebook video chat, FaceTime. I'd have to text a person, say, hey, listen, do you have an iPhone or an Android? Things like that, whereas now everything's centralized onto Zoom. I do it all via Zoom. I also use, like I said, text messenger, things like that as well. And also the program I use is called Keystone. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Keystone. So there's Trainerize, there's all those things. Keystone has not only a training function in it as well, but it also has a MyFitnessPal type situation in it, but I can look at the back end. So I can look up, hey, Alex, what did you eat today? Yep, I like this, I like that, I like this, I like this. Hey, this is what I do differently. And I'm very big on communication with clients as well. I never say, hey, this is wrong or you were wrong. It's what I like and what I would do differently. The reason why is because you have to let them know that their choice wasn't right or wrong. It was maybe situationally inappropriate, or in some cases, situationally appropriate. Now, that's a phrase, I suppose people are using it now, but it's a phrase I coined because nothing's right or wrong. It's, like I said, it's situationally appropriate or situationally inappropriate for the food choices you put into place in that situation.
Yeah, that's a big one. I think when you get, I sort of segregate that into when someone's new and you don't know what you don't know. They come with the binary, hey, Alex, what's the best food for? What's the best thing to, and then go, hey, like, it's fine. And I think also language is really powerful and we have to be careful. And by telling someone wrong, right, that's not really a good coach or a good leader. It's more about empowering people and going, hey, perhaps it depends. It depends, right? It always depends. As I hate saying this, but I don't want to tell you good or bad because it isn't good or bad because it depends. Like, it's not fair to say that donut is bad or it's wrong. It's like, well, it depends on the context. It depends on who's consuming it, what time, why, the goals, all of these things. And I think over time, by coaching your clients to have more of a critical mindset or a critical thinking, they ask better questions. So you're empowering them over time to, rather than just saying, here's the answers, to a degree. Obviously, you've got to give them guidance and structure. It's more about empowering them so they can feel good and go, oh, okay, so if I understand that, maybe I could, right, cool, yeah. Now we're on the we're getting on the right side of things rather than just shutting them off there and going, well, that's stupid, like you said. So I think that's cool how you said, no, this is what I like. This is what I would do differently, because it gives them a chance to think about that and perhaps go, next, okay, yeah, well, what about this? Or maybe I'll try that. So I think that's a really good concept that you use there with the language, and great tips on some of those tools as well.
Yeah, it's actually the proliferation and sort of overuse of the term "it depends" is what actually made me create that phrase of situation appropriate, situation inappropriate. Is because people would say the thing, "Oh, well, it depends." Okay, what does it depend on? And the less educated coach couldn't say, well, it depends, and that was just a lazy man's way of saying, "Fuck off, I don't want to explain this." Whereas situation appropriate, hey, listen, this is what, in this instance, prior to a workout, steak and potatoes probably isn't appropriate, but after a workout or a dinner, when you've got 24 hours to synthesize glycogen, fantastic, thumbs up to you for choosing that meal. The donut or a lolly or whatever the case may be, sit on the couch watching the latest Marvel movie, probably not appropriate, but before a workout or before a marathon run, maybe more appropriate. So that's situationally appropriate or inappropriate. And that's where that came from. It's explanation to put it into an understanding to the common person who may not have the knowledge that I have. Hey, when is it applicable, when it's not, and what does it depend on? Well, this is the reason.
Yeah. So really it's context and sets up the information that comes after that, because ultimately it'll be, okay, well, what is it situationally appropriate or inappropriate for, and you can say, hey, well, example A, example B, and then people can, and I sort of try to use, I guess, metaphors and examples as well that people can relate onto in real life settings, so they can go, okay, I can actually understand that, rather than something where it's, like you said, uneducated. And look, we don't know everything. If you don't know, look, I'll find out, or let me find out the answer, or this is a question for this person. But I think being able to give someone something a little bit more accurate rather than vague, or just telling them, well, I don't want to answer this question, but I'm going to kind of push it away anyways, is not really the best practice for that. So I guess leading on with Sports Nutrition Australia, could you tell us more of your role within the organization, the company, what you do, and how you got involved with Sports Nutrition Australia?
Yeah, so I'm one of the assessors. So when students come in and actually take part in the course and become certified sports nutritionists, so myself and three other guys who are very good at what they do also actually mark the paperwork and run the students through the course and make sure that their practice or their submissions are in line with what's deemed to be adequate, or what's deemed to be sort of competent within the world of sports nutrition. So that's a really good thing as well. To be honest with you, I did the course myself. I think it was early 2018, and I did it just because I was doing a lot of mums and dads and suburbanites in nutrition, and I really wanted to phase across into this performance side of things. And I'd sort of heard, and I'd done the ISSN test. I'm not sure if you're aware of the International Society of Sports Nutrition test. I did that in 2014, and I Googled it online, and this SNA came up. And at the time when I did the SNA course, the test was again it was also a part of the course. It's no longer, it's optional now. But I got onto Alex Thomas, who's the director of Sports Nutrition Association, or formerly Sports Nutrition Australia. And he basically said, yep, let's get you involved. I did the course. I smashed the course out pretty quickly. It's 3 or 4 months, I believe, when I did it. And then probably 6 months ago, Alex called me up and said, hey man, we've always been impressed with what you've been doing. We've been taking note of all the clients and the results and the things you've been doing, and basically my evolution in the sports nutrition realm. And obviously with my background in science, and he just said, listen, I've got a spot coming up for an assessor. Would you want to come on board? And part of what I love to do is educate. I love to help people be better at what they do. And that in turn makes me better at what I do. That's, like you said before, coaching is a skill. There's programming and there's coaching. They're two different conversations. So having the ability to expand not only their knowledge, but also mine as well, it's something I just jumped at. And I was like, Alex, sign me up. And within a month or two, I was a part of it.
Yeah, and what a great compliment as well, in one respect, but also a great way to pay it forward and give back, like you said, to help increase the standard of education around nutrition, which I think me and you both agree it needs to happen. For people listening as well, what would make, and I know we've already discussed this, but what would make Sports Nutrition Australia one of the better options in terms of upskilling in nutritional practices, especially for people who are looking at perhaps, ISSN, and there's that many courses out there and people popping up, but what would be, I guess, more prestigious, or perhaps a better quality qualification or recognition from Sports Nutrition Australia? Is it the coaches and the assessors like yourself that are behind the scenes? Is it the way it's recognized? Is it the way it's taught? Is it the level of knowledge? And perhaps maybe run us through like how far you can take your qualification with Sports Nutrition Australia, and what you could then do with that, just to give people kind of a bit of a roadmap.
Yeah, so the best thing about SNA and why it's the premium sort of sports nutrition course in Australia is, one, to put it in a nuts and bolts situation, is you're qualified. You are insured, you are registered with a governing body, and you have that to fall back on. So if you do give advice and the advice goes wayward, you're insured. That's one of the biggest things that's missing within the fitness industry realm in a massive way. People are giving nutritional advice without any sort of insurance, without any sort of link to fall back on, I suppose you would say. But as for why SNA is the better course in its structure, is the way it applies itself. So if you look at the method and how the actual course goes through, it goes through the basics, the biochemistry, but then it evolves from that into the application side of things. And you talked before about the practical, pragmatic type of things. Is a lot of the course, yes, there's quizzes and little tests you got to do, but it finishes with 6 major case studies. So it actually gives you 6 different scenarios of real world situations where you have to apply the knowledge you've learned in the earlier parts of the course and apply it to a, hypothetical but real world situation. So it's about that applied nutrition knowledge, that applied nutrition science, and actually putting it towards a real world situation. There's no other course that does that. A lot of courses get so messed up in the minutiae of biochemistry, and they're talking about hormones and functions and stuff like that. The reality is that that's less than 3% of the population base. All these people with oh, you've got this and you've got that. Well, that's probably not true. If you understand the basics and the fundamentals of biochemistry, the fundamentals of application, you're going to look after 95% of it. And you mentioned diabetics before. That's one of the thresholds, right? So you understand you're approaching these clients. Well, that's not my scope. Pass it on to our dietitian. Yeah, work with the dietitian and create good networks within the field you're in. Have a good, referral for an EP. Have a good referral for a dietitian, a physio, a chiropractor, whatever the case may be. But know where your scope starts and know where your scope ends. And Sports Nutrition Association really does allow you to define that wall and know where and when you can't work within your practices.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And I think when you were talking about the element of, and I was actually having this conversation today, people may come and go, hey, I've got this or I've got this and I feel like this. And I'm like, well, the irony of that is if we actually get these broad strokes, like these basics down of nutrition, 9 times out of 10, all of those things are alleviated. Because
100%.
It's like you get the big things in the right place. And it's like, oh, like I've just been working with a lady for just 4 weeks. And she's like, Alex, she's like, I'm not bloated anymore. She's like, I've got energy now. I look better. I can lift weights. And she's like, just listing all these things up. She's like, I even look different. I'm like, it's been 4 weeks, but like, she's like, I just can't believe this. And I'm like, right. And it's funny because there was a time where there was a lot of arguments between like, oh, isogenics and this and this and this. And it was like, well, yeah, but focus on this. that is more minutia. And I think that's a really interesting concept again about always mastering the basics in any craft. And yes, for people who are curious like myself, and when you're working with top end athletes, that's when you have to really know your shit. And that's when, or even in the clinical setting, it's like, wow, we're working with special populations here now. This is not the norm. But for the most part, if you get the basics down, it's going to cover a lot of that. And again, having, I think those real life scenarios and real world applications are really critical for coaches coming through, because, a lot of the time you get your qualification, you're in the field and you're actually in front of a real person. And then it's like, and now what do I do?
Yeah. And like the rules remain the same, whatever level of client you're working towards. It's 3 to 5 serves of vegetables, 2 serves of fruit, 2 serves of whole grains a day. I mean, those staples, we call them staples or foundations or fundamentals, whatever phrase you want to use. We call them those for a reason. And you talk about your client earlier today. She feels better because she's getting more nutrients into her bloodstream, which then operates, the production of things like, digestive enzymes and all sort of stuff. So bloating goes down, her bowel movement's probably better and healthier and more frequent and all these crazy things that all she had to do, and many more like her, by the way, not picking on your client, was just get these foundations right. And then everything starts to sort of mold together into a future of just success. And if you start that snowball now, when a client's, and there's a reason why supplement companies put diuretics in their fat burners, because they can drop a kilo of fluid and the person goes, oh my God, this is working. Well, if you get that buy-in on a baseline level and you start to see that snowball of the client's success, they start to feel good about themselves. Then motivation kicks in, then drive kicks in, habits get formed, and all these crazy things happen. And next thing you know, the person's getting a shining light at the end of the tunnel, So foundations should be mandatory. Don't worry about the hormones and the neurotransmitters and the choline and all sort of crazy stuff. Just get the basics right first and then move forward.
Love it. That was one of my points, was keeping it simple, which I think we've kind of in that respect. Now, if memory serves, you got a client in half an hour. Is that right?
I got a client in 5 minutes.
Oh, in 5. Right. Okay then. So I thought it was 5:30. All right. Well, I guess we'll have to wrap it up there, my friend. I do appreciate your time. Before I go, I'll get some rapid fire questions going, then I'll finish with my last one if you can spare me the 5 minutes. I appreciate it.
Of course.
The first one is actually He's not a rapid fire, but I'm going to, because I noticed you've got a Whoop. You're wearing a Whoop. Am I right?
I'm wearing a Whoop. Yes.
Right. I've been wondering, like, I've not done much research into it yet. I've heard some facts. Worth it or not? And obviously, for someone who's a little bit more savvy and wants the data and feedback, what's your experience been like with it?
I've had it for 2 weeks, or a week and a half, I should say. I love it. To me, I'm one of the 25% of people that if I can see my output in metrics, I will actually try and increase my output to match it. So, we know that, things like predominant step count, although they're an arbitrary number to offer to a person, if we give them a target, they're more likely to hit that target because we've given them a number which they can track. I bought the Whoop for what's called strain rate. So it doesn't measure steps. It has the function to measure steps, but it doesn't measure steps. It measures strain rate. So your physical output based on your exertion levels, heart rate elevation, things like that. But it also measures recovery via the way HRV, so heart rate variability, which is a big interest of mine as well, along with sleep. I'm a chronic undersleeper. I'll admit that. It's a work in progress for the last 35 years of my life. So it tells me when I should push hard and when I should maybe give the day a bit of a miss or take it a bit easier. And that's what I love. So I check mine regularly, about 3 or 4 times a day, and just check the data on your phone. The one thing about Whoop, which I do like, is because calories are enormously wrong on wrist-worn devices. That's pretty well documented, up to 40%. So when you see people put up, their 4,000 calorie workout on their Apple Watch, it's like, no, mate, nowhere near that. We'd all be shredded units or wasting away, if that was the case, if people are doing 2,000 calories before 5 a.m. But where Whoop is a little bit different is it uses 2 algorithms. It uses the resting algorithm and uses an active algorithm, which then it changes at a certain heart rate. I don't know what the heart rate is, but that's where it happens. Most wrist-worn devices have one algorithm, which is based on resting heart rate, and it's not extrapolated out when the heart rate gets elevated. So that's where that change happens, and that's the reason I like it. It's also, I like watches. I collect watches. So it's not a, fitness watch. So it allows me to still wear my very nice, designer watches and not interfere with that. So it's a bit douchey as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's good. And I appreciate the synopsis because I'm looking at getting one for many reasons, which you aforementioned. And again, you slayed a lot of myths because, I'm not a massive fan of the Apple Watch. Second one is before the last one, and this is selfishly, and we might have to keep it to the point because I don't know how detailed you can go with this. But again, processed foods versus whole foods compositions in the diet. Pretty much the context of the question was, I've got a client on 4,000 calories. His metabolism is just unbelievable. What is a diminishing return on? He's still getting his the recommendations for vegetables, for whole foods, etc. But where is now the point where it's like now you're filling your calories with too many processed foods? And we were talking about some studies today. We don't know. Is there enough literature to say, well, at this point of this many processed foods, if still calorie balance is equal with protein, fat, and carbs, that there is any health risks? Do you know where I'm coming from with that?
Yeah, I do. So, the general thing is you mentioned before 80-20, right? The biggest thing to remember is if you're sticking to your serves of vegetables. Now, obviously, as your calorie intake extrapolates up, if the person's a larger person, their protein is going to go up. So a really easy way to do it is match your vegetable intake per meal with the protein source per meal. So if you're going to have 180 grams of beef, for example, in a meal, you'll match that with vegetable count. That's a good way to balance out. No maths involved, no how much fiber is in this broccoli. It's just a real easy, balanced out visual thing to do. If the individual is an active individual and they're getting sort of, between 13 and 18 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories ingested, so in that case, that would be sort of 50 grams of fiber a day. If that's been taken care of by, say, 3,200 calories, hypothetically, of course, along with the 3 to 5 serves of vegetables, 2 serves of fruit, 2 serves of whole grain, those baseline foundations we said before, I would never challenge that person on 600-800 calories of a more processed food. I would always be okay with that. In fact, in most cases, I generally have a golden rule. If the person is, say, if they're on 4,000 calories, they're probably fairly active, to be honest. So I would say, for most males, my golden ticket is 400 grams of carbs or less will generally be whole foods. And then anything above that, we can start to introduce some more simple. But even then, there's gradation there, right? So 300 grams of carbs could be really starchy veggies, for example, starchy carb sources. But then that last 100 could be like white rice or white bread And then after 400 grams, that's when we get into things like you might have a paddle pop at nighttime, you might have some chocolate, you might have whatever the case may be. With women, it's about 300 grams to 350, and that's just due to food volume. If you're getting 4,000 calories via the way of chicken and brown rice and broccoli, you're going to be there all day. You know, so it's a reality about the cost per bite conversation, but also we have to be, as trainers and coaches, we have to be realistic about what can this person do in their lifestyle. If they work a construction job and you've got them eating 500 grams of sweet potato, 200 grams of chicken and 150 grams of broccoli at 1 o'clock in the afternoon while they're out in the sun, they're going to hate you. They're going to last about a week and a half with you, you know? So that's where you have to be realistic. How is this person going about doing what they're doing, and what's the application to their life?
Yeah, no, 100%. And like you said, there's probably more conversations to have around that. And maybe this is where, if you're keen, a round 2 is involved. My last signature question, and you can answer this as quick as you like, Phil. It's usually, can you identify a fear in your life, big or small, what it was, and how you overcame it, if you have, or if you're still trying to conquer it? And that could be something like public speaking, could be a fear of failure, it could be, you know, thinking that it could be something maybe when you started working for Sports Nutrition Australia, I don't know, whatever it is to you.
Yeah, stepping out of my own would be the biggest fear. You know, we mentioned before we started recording the loss of clients, and then me really panicking about that. And then, you know, within a day and a half, I'd filled those clients with a waiting list, you know. So that sort of stuff is, when I stepped out into SportPlus on my own, it was, to say I was shit scared is the world's biggest understatement. And now with these changes, the way I'm changing the way SportPlus operates, that fear has come back again. But I mentioned, I don't want to, that's not true. I do want to sing Elite Vitality's praises as much as I possibly can. They've let me say it's okay to identify your fears. It's okay to identify the things that are holding you back. But then once you identify them, there's no choice but to move forward. You know, and that's, you know, what did Reese say to me? Reese said to me, I have an addiction to stability is the phrase he uses, because the unknown is always unstable until you make it stable. So, yeah.
No,
that's it. So stepping out on my own, that was a huge thing for me. Massive.
For sure. No, it's always a great question to get the insights from some of the great minds, and people sort of.
That is a good question, man.
Really? Yeah, you know, it is. And it's important, you know, to talk about fears, and there's a lot we could say about them, you know, fearless training. There's a lot of meaning behind all of that, because I think it's one of the biggest things that holds us back. And I think by admitting them and getting them out there, other people can learn from them too and go, you know what? I'm not alone. And some people who they may put on pedestals, they think, wow, they're going through the same stuff. They're also human. I think we're all facing an internal battle no one knows anything about. And sometimes verbalizing that can really help. Phil, mate, you've been absolutely phenomenal. Tell the people where they can find you, resources, links, websites, plug away, my friend. And I'll make sure I put them in the show notes.
Awesome, man. The best place, honestly, is Instagram. I'm on Facebook as well, but I'm definitely much more active on Instagram. SportPlus_Performance. That's my tag on Insta. Give us a follow, give us a shout out, send us a DM if you want any help. I'm happy to help.
Awesome, dude. Awesome. I'll put that in the show notes as always for everyone. Make sure you go and check out Phil, guys. He's the real deal. As you can see, a fountain of knowledge at the very least. And I'm sure there's much more we can talk about. So thanks again for your time, Phil. I really appreciate it, even though we went over a little bit. I'll let you get on to your client. And guys, for all of you listening, very quickly, you already know, leave a rating and a review if you liked it. Make sure you share, subscribe if you're on YouTube. Of course, if it's safe to do so. And of course, until the next episode, guys, stay fearless.